In the past, there has been a close-knit relationship between language learning and translation practice, and this was premised on the obvious fact that interlingual translation is an essential part of the process by which the spaces between languages are negotiated. However, the late 20th century saw changes in scholarly practice that brought both language learning and translation studies to a state of mutual isolation. In the context of translation studies, it was felt that there was more to translation practice than just bilingual skill, and that the discipline needed to be pursued independently of language learning courses to address the full range of factors involved. Likewise, the emergence of the communicative model and immersion practices in the language learning classroom meant that translation was no longer considered the best means of testing language acquisition, and this inevitably led to any use of it in teaching contexts being met with a high degree of skepticism. There has been something of a revival of interest in translation practices from the perspective of language learning, spurred on by Guy Cook's 2010 book, Translation in Language Teaching, published as part of the Oxford Applied Linguistics series. From the perspective of translation studies, in 2013, Anthony Pym published a major study into how translation practices are currently utilised in language learning classrooms in the European Union. While Pym's literature review revealed that the general consensus among teachers and theorists of language education is that translation can indeed contribute to effective language learning, his findings suggest that teachers found it difficult to view translation as a language learning method in its own right. In their view, translation was a part of more general teaching methodologies, mostly as a check on what has been acquired, sometimes as an exploration of the differences between language systems. Pym champions the use of translation in the L2 classroom. Indeed, he proposes translation as the fifth skill to be practiced by the bilingual mind, alongside reading, listening, speaking, and writing. But following this study, he asserts that the ongoing focus should be on how it can be used effectively and creatively. We would like to respond to this question by broadening our understanding of what we mean by both language learning and translation. Our ideas emerged from a research project funded by the Monash Warwick Alliance called Collaborative Translation, a Model for Inclusion. It proposes a model for collaborative translation practice and applies it to multiple contexts to demonstrate its value through a number of outcomes. One of these contexts is language learning, but it is language learning conceived of as a process that is not necessarily confined to the acquisition of a single bordered language, but rather a broader process of engagement with and experience of language use that opens one's mind to different modes of communication and means of expression. This additionally means that translation is no longer a practice that is relevant exclusively to the paradigm of the bilingual subject, but it can be engaged with by so-called monolingual speakers as part of a process of exposure to alterity and knowledge acquisition.
Our starting point for this thinking is Yasmin Yilditz's hypothesis of the post-monolingual condition. Yildiz claims that the idea of a singular language structure is a modern invention, and one that has resulted in a world where language boundaries are enforced in much the same way as national boundaries. Indeed, Yildiz links the monolingual condition to the roots of nationalism, where the creation of national borders is understood as a process that proposes heterogeneity in what lies outside borders and homogeneity of what lies within them. Yildiz argues that this structuring of language, which many of us may take for granted as natural and indifferent, is actually highly political. Since monolingualism has historically tended to limit the capacity of its subjects to a single language, it has produced a world dominated by monolingual speakers. Following this train of logic, some scholars express the view that the ideal antidote to the monolingual condition is the acquisition of multiple language proficiencies. However, Yildiz suggests that this is too simplistic, since this only enforces dominant orthodoxies on the nature of language. To express it analogically, the proposed solution of multilingualism does not challenge the borders of the monolingual, but merely allows the individual subject to acquire a passport for crossing those borders. The post-monolingual condition should therefore be understood as a critique of the monolingual and multilingual alike. And Yildiz offers that the clearest strategy to pursuing this critique is to admit the fluidity that exists between languages and to recognise the partitioning that occurs within languages. Yildiz's hypothesis can be applied to an analysis of modern translation practices. The dominant practice in translation is what we identify as the L1 approach, in which the direction of translation always favours the native language of the translator. In this context, the translator is required to have proficiency in a second language, and that they are therefore capable of translating text in that language into the language they acquired in childhood. The dominance of this practice is reflected in legal frameworks where international bodies of translator accreditation examine candidates on their L2 capacity in the same way they examine them on their L1 capacity, so that most translators will only attempt accreditation in the latter. The L2 translation process is sometimes used outside legal frameworks where professional L1 translators cannot be obtained, and some researchers in translation studies have investigated whether this method may replicate the results of L1 practice. However, the research has not yet demonstrated the viability of the L2 model, as it generally results in inferior target texts or slower production times, except in extreme instances where second language fluency has been honed and perfected over a very long period of language immersion. Therefore, as an alternative to traditional L1 translation, L2 remains a problematic option at best. What is common to both the L1 and L2 models is that they are predicated on multilingual capacities. A practitioner may only translate from a language in which they have acquired the requisite proficiency through a learning process that teaches language as a monolingual structure. In these respects, current translation practices, while they rely on multilingual subjects, remain bounded by monolingual paradigms, since they treat languages as finite geographic spaces contained by borders that are, if not inviolable, then at least perpetually rigid, and that travel over these borders must be both limited and regulated by standards of expertise. If a post-monolingual approach to language learning is to be pursued, it must allow for the softening of the regulatory approach to translation, and by extension allow for the embrace of learning processes that are not focused on the concentrated acquisition of singular monolingual proficiencies. A number of collaborative translation models have been proposed in recent years, but most of them involve the use of multiple L1 translators working collectively, and therefore do not depart significantly from dominant practice. Our project challenges the necessity of L1 skills as the basic currency of translation practice, and instead opens the model to incorporate a range of skills and proficiencies in two or more participants, who are defined as the source collaborator and the target collaborator. The source collaborator is required to have native competency in the source language and to have a sufficient level of the target language to be able to communicate verbally with the target collaborator. It is also expected that the source collaborator has some knowledge of the cultural background in which the source text was written. The target collaborator is required to have native competency in the target language of the translation. They are not required to have proficiency in the source language, but they might be expected to have some disciplinary expertise in the subject of the text or in translation practice more generally. The translation itself involves a talk process in which the source collaborator sight translates the source text orally. By following the verbal cues, the target collaborator attempts to transcribe the sense of the verbal translation into a grammatical written draft. The source and target collaborators then undertake a process of discussion in which an agreed sense of the source meaning is established in the target language. An advantage of this method is that the source collaborator is uniquely able to clarify nuances of the source language that might be lost to an L1 translator working in isolation. Additionally, the target collaborator is uniquely able to ensure that the translation choices comply with the disciplinary expectations that are applied to the text. Our model encourages the participation of translation practitioners, particularly since their familiarity with translation procedures can be applied to the process. However, the model does not allow these translators to work with the source languages they have worked with in the past. This results in a more inclusive approach to language, as it cuts against the idea that to participate in the translation process, one must have a bilingual capacity in the languages of the translation. The outcome of this process may be understood as an engagement with language more generally, rather than with a particular set of languages.
The case studies we are pursuing in our project allow for multiple collaborative learning opportunities for participants, including engaging in a dialogue between disciplines and cultures. What is perhaps most beneficial is the engagements with language that it affords. For example, one of our case studies involves a translation of a Brazilian short story from Portuguese into English. The T1 collaborator, Alice, has little to no proficiency in Portuguese, but she is a published English translator of Spanish Latin American literature, and so her engagement with a closely related language and culture affords her important points of comparison and new cultural knowledge that can enrich her own professional practice. I have experienced a similar opportunity in a translation I am undertaking with a German collaborator based at the University of Constance. Madeline and I have been collaborating to translate a set of German questionnaire items into English as part of Madeline's research in educational psychology. I have no training in German, nor do I have any plans to study the language in a formal context. My background is in French, and I have worked as a French-English translator for a number of years. Etymologically, German is more closely related to English than the Romance languages, and the engagement with a language that is closely related to my own native tongue remains an important instance of language development in the context of my professional activities as a translator and as a university tutor in translation studies, as it provides me with insights into the structures and transferable qualities of language. The purpose of the questionnaire in German is to measure the emotional experiences that high school students have in relation to the study of STEM subjects such as math, biology, chemistry, and physics. The English translation of the items will be used by Madeline and her colleagues when they disseminate the results of the questionnaire to Anglophone audiences. These are a couple of the items we translated and some discussion we touched upon that is relevant to my experience of language learning. First, Madeline and my negotiation of these items highlighted a couple of important grammatical points that instantly changed the way I was engaging with the German texts. Until reaching these items, I had been translating the names of the school subjects with capital letters, recreating in English what I assumed to be a cultural or a discipline-specific formatting choice in the German. Madeline, meanwhile, interpreted this choice on my part as indicative of English school subject labelling. When we reached the second item shown here, I had to ask why the words Spaß and Lust were capitalized, and Madeline explained the simple fact that all nouns are capitalized in German. This new knowledge on my part helped me think differently about my choice to capitalize the labels, and once I had explained this to Madeline, we renegotiated it and decided not to capitalize. I also had to ask in both cases why there seemed to be more commas in the German than were called for, and Madeline explained how the comma is used in infinitive sentences. Such a simple fact, combined with the knowledge that nouns are capitalized, had me looking at each German item in a very different way, able to identify aspects of the sentence with more confidence. In fact, by the time we had concluded 10 weekly meetings, I was able to guess at translations of some of the more simple German items. On a semantic level, Madeline and I considered the difference between translating machen as doing or taking math. In English, these options would seem to distinguish between the act of working through mathematical problems and the actual class or course of mathematics. While I felt that taking was preferable because it referred to undertaking math at school rather than referring to the act of doing mathematical problems, Madeline insisted that the German item expressed a more general engagement with math beyond the idea of a school course, and so we settled on doing. This negotiation made me think of a comparison with the French verb faire, meaning to do or to make, and in some cases translatable into English as to take. This highlighted for me the transferability of language insights that come from this collaborative process. In a discussion between Madeline and myself as we reflected on the process, she observed that the source collaborator needs to have a certain level of confidence with the target language in order to identify and question nuances of the draft that don't work as translations of the source. For example, she hadn't questioned my use of capital letters for the subject labels. Similarly, I learnt that the target collaborator needs to be able to articulate the layers of meaning expressed in the draft in enough detail that the source collaborator can then identify and question nuances that don't work as translations of the source. For example, it was important that I articulated the nuance in the phrase taking math as opposed to doing math so that we could negotiate our ideas on it. This level of confidence and capacity to articulate nuance are both aspects of language use that are learnt and honed through the process of collaborative translation.
A major outcome to which our research aims is the goal of changing widespread perceptions about translation practice, as much concerning those working within the field as those outside of it. Current translation practice is dominated by the burden of the monolingual, which enforces the attitude that participation in translation processes can only be permitted when the practitioner has, through an arduous process of language study, acquired the proficiencies that allow them to cross the borders of language. We've proposed that translation is an activity that can be accessible to those with a diverse range of language capacities, and that by opening this participation to a collaborative process, translation may be made culturally and linguistically richer. We see this outcome as working to the heart of the monolingual condition, and moreover as proposing a way of thinking about translation that is distinctly post-monolingual. However, we additionally see our project's intersection with language learning as providing post-monolingual approaches for that field also, where the focus is not on the acquisition of a specific language, but on developing the capacity to grasp language as a process of engagement. The collaborative component, whereby the learning of language is facilitated through a relationship, is central to this, since it allows a greater freedom of movement between the spaces of language, using the natural inclination for humans to engage with and learn from the experiences of others. The collaborative model we have pursued therefore rejects the premise that the goal of reintegrating translation into the language teaching classroom relies on translation demonstrating its value, and instead asserts that translation and language learning are wholly intertwined concepts, and that a rethinking of one enables a fundamental rethinking of